We, at the end of October, released a whistleblower report that looked into self-dealing within a massive $250 million taxpayer-funded program called the Community Reinvestment Program. This was Democrats' answer to the war on drugs, I guess. They passed it into law in 2022, funded it with millions and millions of dollars. And essentially, if you had the right skin pigmentation, you could use this fund to get money toward the purchase of a home, to even get your personal credit card debt paid off. And what we found via a whistleblower, if you read that initial report, was that the BIPOC nonprofits that were contracted with the state to get that money out to members of the Black community and other select communities of color were often using that money to help themselves and to help their family members. We told many different stories within that first report from the end of October about self-dealing. Employee of the Urban League getting $49,000 to pay off credit card debt. The daughter of an employee of the Urban League getting $350,000 toward the purchase of a home. And we said at the time that we ran that initial report that we had a lot of follow-up to do. It was only scratching the surface of the alleged self-dealing within the program that our whistleblower told us about. So in the weeks that have followed, we've been tracking down leads, following up on tips, digging into documents, and today we published our second installment in our work looking into the Community Reinvestment Program. The headline, it's an infuriating one: From Fugitive Felon to Homeowner. Thanks to Washington taxpayers, the list of insiders who benefited from a taxpayer-funded program for people of color include a convicted pimp and a preacher with direct ties to the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. So in this latest edition, we again focus strictly on the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. As we've said before, it is not the only BIPOC nonprofit contracted with the state to hand out this money, but there is so much there that we still have not exhausted the alleged self-dealing within this one organization, the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. So after our last whistleblower report, we continued to track down names and tips about potential people working at the Urban League who benefited from this money. And here's the difficulty in this, because I want to be clear. We've asked the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle to simply provide us with a list. You know what? We're already on to you. Let's just have a full list of all Urban League employees, board members, staff members, and their family members who were given Community Reinvestment Program funds through your organization. Let's just, in the interest of transparency, put all our cards on the table, but they have refused to do so. So short of going to every county in the state and digging through tens of thousands of property records and cross-referencing them with publicly available data to see if we can find people who work for the Urban League, we have no way on our own of compiling a complete list. So all we can rely on are tips. And that's what we've relied on to add a couple more names to the list of Urban League insiders who have benefited from this money. One of them is a guy named Bobby Tramble. So this is an infuriating aspect of this story for anybody in the state of Washington who's ever struggled to buy a home. So Bobby Tramble, there's a couple things going on in this case. He is an employee with the Urban League. At least he still presents himself as that on his LinkedIn. He's the supervisor of homeless outreach. And he got $238,000 in taxpayer public funds to be able to just a few months ago purchase a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bathroom home in Puyallup. $238,000. Now, there's a couple things here that I want to point out. So first is the obvious conflict of interest in self-dealing. He's an employee of the Urban League, and the Urban League gave him $100,000 of that $238,000. And they used community reinvestment funds they'd been given by the state to get out to community members to once again benefit someone who works for them. Now, that is a story we've told you before. That was really the crux of our entire first whistleblower report. But there's an added little layer here with Bobby. Not only is Bobby an employee of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, he's also a career criminal. We looked at police reports and public records going back 35 years. And Bobby Tramble has multiple felony convictions. He's had more than 50 warrants for his arrest since 1985. He is a convicted pimp, a convicted drug dealer, someone who's been convicted of unlawful possession of a firearm. Let me read you here from one of these court documents we uncovered from a 2015 case when he was a fugitive from justice. Yes, just 10 years ago, a fugitive from justice who was featured on Washington's Most Wanted with David Rose. So this is prosecutors laying out their case and trying to make an argument for a high bail. They said currently the defendant, Bobby Tramble, is on a warrant status for failing to appear to arraignment for a pending unlawful possession of a firearm, distribution of cocaine, and distribution of heroin case. In that case, the defendant was arrested in March of 2015 in possession of a handgun with 2 loaded magazines, even though he was a felon prohibited from owning a firearm, over 5 grams of cocaine, a small amount of heroin, and a large amount of cash. The money was separated into stacks of $100. Officers later determined that the handgun recovered in the defendant's car had been stolen in a residential burglary in May of 2014. 2 days after his arrest, the defendant was out of custody and selling narcotics to undercover SPD officers. Additionally, it appears from the discovery provided in this case that the defendant was likely engaged in the promotion of prostitution during the past several months, although charges relating to that have not yet been filed. The defendant's criminal history includes prior convictions for unlawful possession of a firearm in the first degree, 3 counts felony VUXA, which is a drug crime, delivery of cocaine, promoting prostitution in the first degree, promoting prostitution in the second degree, on and on and on. The defendant has 47 cases showing warrant activity, and there have been 50 warrants issued out of King County for his arrest since 1986. What does that get you in Washington state? It gets you $250,000 in free taxpayer money to buy a house. Forget the connection to the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. Think of how many people out there have done everything right, have gone to school, graduated from school, got jobs, and still cannot afford to buy a home, have never been in trouble a day in their life, and aren't getting jack shit from the state of Washington except high taxes. So it adds this really in what this whistleblower report focuses on are a couple things. Yes, we provide these 2 instances just in the interest of sharing the growing list of Urban League insiders who are benefiting. In addition to Bobby Tramble, there's also a man named Joseph Manaway, who we've uncovered with help from our whistleblower. He's a local preacher, very well connected, and according to documents that we've obtained, he got $100,000 from the Urban League, and his LinkedIn currently lists himself as the Director of Fund Development at the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. So add 2 more names to the rapidly growing list of insiders who've benefited from taxpayer funds that were entrusted to the Urban League of Seattle to get out to deserving and qualifying community members. So that in and of itself is enough here. But you add that added layer of the fundamental unfairness of a program like this. You know, in our first whistleblower report, I spoke to a mom. She's Black, her kid's Black. He's in his late 20s. He graduated from high school, got great grades, went to college. She said he's worked a job since he was 16 years old. Sometimes he's worked 2 jobs, has never been in trouble. Good kid. But he's in his late 20s in Washington. Basically, anyone in their late 20s in Washington has a hell of a hard time buying a home. So as a member of the Black community in Seattle, he applied through the Urban League to try to get his hands on some of these funds that were given to the Urban League for just that purpose, went through all the hoops, only to be told that he wasn't going to be accepted, wasn't going to get the money. And members of the community had been told that the money that the Urban League had to give out had dried up. And then after they're telling people the money's dried up, they're giving these, 6-figure payouts to their own employees. And in this case, an employee who was a career criminal. Now, maybe he's kept his nose clean for the last 10 years. He now works in homeless outreach. I think that's great. If he was able to turn his life around and he's not engaged in any sort of criminal conduct and he's found something useful and meaningful to do with his life, I think that's fantastic. I have people who've committed crimes in my own family. I want nothing more than for them to continue to lead productive lives and leave that past behind them. It doesn't mean you get a free house. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't mean you get $250,000 in our hard-earned money. People who have done nothing but pay taxes and follow the law. So a convicted pimp and drug dealer who carried around a loaded stolen gun that was taken from a home in a residential burglary, that he gets $250,000 to make it easier to buy a home. But that really is the essence of what this whole program was designed to do. The Community Reinvestment Program was passed again by Democrats to make amends for the war on drugs, to help people who were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. I don't know about you, but when I hear, war on drugs, first of all, I don't think you should serve a lengthy prison sentence for drug possession, simple possession, where it's for personal use, you're addicted to drugs, and you're in a crisis. And I think that there were times in the 80s and 90s where people got awfully high jail or prison sentences when they probably should have got or been given some form or fashion of help for their substance abuse issue. But that's not what we're talking about here with Bobby Tramble. If anything, he perpetuated the war on drugs by dealing drugs to these very community members who then went to prison when they were caught with those narcotics. But I mean, the essence of the program is really about helping criminals. In a lot of cases, I mean, there's a huge element of the program that we haven't even gotten into yet that is specifically to assist people with re-entry into the community. So specifically to help people once they get out of prison. And again, I'm all for that. I want people to have a chance at a better life and make sure they're on a better path forward. But the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle gets millions of dollars in private donations. They can do that with that money. They can do that with that money. And it doesn't mean that you should get tens of thousands of dollars to pay off credit card debt that you've racked up to put you in a better position to buy a home. It doesn't mean that taxpayers should foot the bill for you to start a business or to purchase a house or a condo. So there's this real fundamental unfairness and discriminatory aspect of this program. I mean, at the baseline, gifting people public funds based on their skin pigmentation is wrong. The federal government should take a look at this. There is no way in the world it should be lawful. And the only reason Democrats get around it is the way that they word state law. They basically say, well, these funds should go to community programs that match these skin pigments. But they put the wording in there, including but not limited to. So then they can say, oh, we're not excluding white people. Yeah, I would love to see a white person walk into the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle and ask them if they could get help with a home down payment. Would love to see how that works out for them. So as you guys know, as we've been tracking this story, and there is so much more to come, we're going to be on this like a dog on a bone because apparently the legacy media doesn't care about it at all. One other news organization, since we broke this story at the end of October, the Center Square of Washington, all the credit in the world to them for picking it up and going to investigate other aspects of self-dealing within this program and adding to our reporting, doing their own reporting, which has had fantastic results so far. The only other outlet in the state that's been willing to pick it up. I was joking with Nicole today. I said, how many days until the Seattle Times does a story on this? But only as a way to paint me as a bigot for exposing it, because you know that story is coming. So we do this story end of October. And I'll tell you, I was inundated and continue to be inundated with emails, social media comments from members of Seattle's Black community who are livid about this. Not mad at me, mad at the Urban League, who say that they feel wronged, who say they've lost trust in the Urban League. And we continue to talk to those individuals. One of them, a former Urban League employee, is quoted in the story that came out this morning, which you can find no paywall on Patreon and Locals. But you'll remember a couple weeks ago after a story aired, the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle posted a statement about it on their social media pages. I'm going to read that for you again in full because it's important in the context of our continued investigation. The Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle is aware of recent media reports and remains steadfast in its commitment to transparency, accountability, and equity across all programs. Our organization operates under strict guidelines and eligibility requirements established by the Washington State Department of Commerce, ensuring every applicant is treated fairly and equitably. We take all concerns about program administration seriously and remain dedicated to maintaining the public's trust in every aspect of our work. The allegations made about our organization contain false and misleading claims. We deny these assertions and stand firmly by our record. Here's the problem. Despite multiple requests that they do so, the Urban League has never explained to us what is false and misleading about our report. If there was truly something false about our report, I would have anticipated a cease and desist. This is an organization that has hundreds of millions of dollars, massive donors. If there was actually something false about the report, they would have sued us over it by now. they would have sent us a cease and desist, and they haven't. And they haven't answered, including up to yesterday, an email that we sent saying, listen, we want to follow up on the statement that you put out ahead of another report that we're publishing tomorrow. And certainly, if there is anything that we have said and reported on that is false or misleading, detail that for us, and we would be more than happy. In fact, it is our duty and obligation to make a correction. And you know by now that I'm happy to make a correction if we got something wrong. But we didn't get anything wrong. All of this is based on publicly available data and information. The other thing that I want to point out in that Urban League statement, and if you go to this statement on their Facebook page, you'll see members of the Black community who aren't mad at me. They're mad at the Urban League. The Urban League says in here that it has a commitment to transparency and accountability. Where's the transparency? Where's the accountability? We've asked multiple times, in the interest of transparency to the community you serve, provide us with a list of names. Let's just put all our cards on the table, because if not, this is going to be a leak, drip, 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 drip. And I'll tell you what, my experience as a reporter, better to get it all out there at once and move on. But instead, we have to go out there, follow up on tips and sources, and work with our whistleblower, Corey Orvold. And we're going to continue to push out stories. Every time we find another Urban League insider who benefited from this money, we're going to continue to push out individual stories. Do you want that? Or do you just want to give us the list of names? And they say, and they've told us that this is a privacy issue. That's bullshit. It's not a privacy issue. Why is it not a privacy issue? Because when you buy a house, you have to file those documents with the county. Those documents are publicly available for people who want them. So there's no data as part of any of this, no information that the public can't get its hands on if it knows what to look for. So there's no privacy to be protected. Does that make sense? So they're just making up an excuse. They just know that that list is probably very long. And that list probably does not look very good for them. I sent them an email yesterday asking them if they've taken any internal actions to begin any sort of internal review. As you know, we reported on it yesterday, the Urban League of Tacoma has already, even though they weren't the subject of our reporting, put their CEO on leave and launched an independent third-party investigation because there's now been some concerns from their community about how they may have handled community reinvestment program funds. And again, they're not even the subject of our story yet. I'll just put a little pin in that for you. So what has the Urban League in Metropolitan Seattle done? We don't know. For all this talk of transparency and accountability, they sure aren't showing much interest in being transparent or accountable. Now, as you know, and we have another story, we had so much information that we've gathered between our last report and this one. It was too much to put all in the same follow-up report. So we have another one airing next week, and it's going to talk about some of the gatekeeping within the Black community. That there are people who are mad that this story was brought by a Black whistleblower to a white lady. And you will not believe some of the correspondences that we have uncovered as part of their efforts to keep this within the Black community, even though the taxpayer money is all of our money, Black, white, Asian. So you're saying if we're not Black, then we're not able to demand accountability for our money? That makes no sense. And then, of course, we continue to hear from Republican state lawmakers, no Democrats thus far, who say that they are eager to look into this. I'll just read you this quick. Andrew Barkis, who's a state representative, Republican from Olympia, who sits on the House Housing Committee. He told me in a text message, recent information and allegations on the unfair allocation practices of the CRP funding are very concerning. He said, when the people the program is designed for are passed over to provide the taxpayer-funded resources to felons and others who benefit from who they know, the system is broken. As you know, Republicans tried to introduce 2 bills this past legislative session that would have prevented some of this self-dealing, put more safeguards in place. Democrats wouldn't hear them. Senate Minority Leader John Braun has said he's going to reintroduce those bills this session. Will Democrats hear them this time around? We don't know. In the meantime, we followed up with the Department of Commerce to ask where their investigation stands. We also know the Attorney General's office has been in contact with our whistleblower, so TBD in that regard. But I think just fundamentally, there's a problem here with the program, which I think I was just getting out of mainstream news at the time that this program was being thought up, so perhaps didn't cover it with the vigor that I should have. We can't award taxpayer money to people based on race. HUD has a role in this. Housing and Urban Development needs to be investigating this and threatening to pull other funding if programs like this don't cease. Because we now have multiple programs. I mentioned $238,000 for Bobby Tramble, the career felon. 100,000 of that came from Urban League, but 138,000 came from another program that does something very similar, the newly passed Covenant Homeownership Reparations Program, that provides money toward down payment assistance to first-time homebuyers of color. Neither of those programs should be legal. They're both discrimination, and we're going to continue to point out problems with how those programs are administered.